the invisible wound and the gambler's debt. The silence in the small adobe house was heavier than the storm clouds gathering over the New Mexico horizon. Luke Tanner, a man who had spent his life reading the faces of desperate men across poker tables, found himself unable to read the woman standing in his kitchen. She was Anna Blake, the woman he had won, or perhaps lost, in a high-stakes bet at the Dusty Spur Saloon just 3 days prior. To the town of Bitter Creek, she was homeless Anna, a mail-order bride whose original groom had died of cholera, leaving her stranded and penniless. To Luke, she was a reminder of his own recklessness. But as the first crack of thunder rattled the window panes, the silence was shattered by a confession that would change everything. "I've been aching down there," Anna whispered. The words hit Luke like a physical blow. He froze, a half-sharpened knife in his hand. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was pale, her frame slight under a dress that had seen too many miles and too much dust. Her hands were clenched so tightly into her skirts that her knuckles looked like polished white stones. Her gray eyes, usually clouded with a strange, distant stoicism, were now swimming with a pain so deep it seemed to come from her very marrow. "Anna." Luke's voice was a low rasp. He stepped toward her, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth floor. "What are you saying? If you're sick, if that man at the station did something to you." "No," she interrupted, her voice shaking but certain. "It isn't a sickness you can catch, Luke. It's a sickness of the soul. It aches because I've been working since I was a child. Not just working, laboring. At my father's warehouse back east, I was the one who moved the crates when the men were too tired. I was the one who stood on the freezing docks for 20 hours a day, keeping the ledgers because my father didn't want to pay a clerk. I've carried the weight of 1,000 men on these shoulders, and I never once asked for a chair. I never once asked for a rest. And now that I'm here, in this quiet place, the silence is letting the pain speak." Luke felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He had spent the last 3 days treating her like an unwanted piece of furniture. He had been angry at the world, angry at Silas Vane for the rigged bet that forced this marriage, and he had taken that anger out through coldness. He had seen her moving slowly and assumed she was lazy. He had seen her wince and assumed she was fragile. He hadn't realized he was looking at a woman who had been pushed past the breaking point of human endurance. "I didn't marry you to be a burden," Anna continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the rising wind. "I just didn't want you thinking something was wrong with me when I moved slow. I didn't want to be a disappointment. Not again. Everyone looks at me and sees a leftover woman. They see someone with no value. I thought, maybe here, with a man who lost a bet to get me, I could finally just be." The social justice of her words pierced Luke's cynical exterior. She wasn't just talking about physical pain, she was talking about the invisibility of the working class, the way society uses up the low status until they are hollow shells, and then discards them. Luke, the lonely cowboy who had gambled away his family's legacy, realized he and Anna were two sides of the same tarnished coin. "You're not a disappointment, Anna," Luke said, his voice regaining its strength. He reached out, hesitating before placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. He felt her flinch, not out of fear of him, but out of the sheer shock of being touched with kindness. "And you're not a punishment. I was the one who was blind. I was the one who let the town's gossip tell me who you were instead of asking you myself." Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple. The desert wind, which had been a low moan, suddenly rose to a predatory shriek. A massive gust slammed into the house, making the heavy timber beams groan like dying giants. A sharp crack echoed from above, the sound of the roof's main support splintering under the pressure. "The roof!" Luke shouted. Before he could move, a section of the heavy clay tiles gave way. Rain, cold, hard, and relentless, poured into the kitchen. The elements were invading their small sanctuary, mirroring the chaos of their lives. But as the water splashed onto the floor, Anna didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked at the hole in the ceiling, then back at Luke. "The buckets are in the lean-to," she said, her eyes suddenly clear of tears and filled with a terrifyingly sharp intelligence. "If we don't divert the water, the adobe walls will turn to mud and the whole structure will collapse by midnight. Luke, don't just stand there. We have to fight." In that moment, the fragile bride vanished. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly how to survive a collapse. As Luke ran for the tools, he realized the suspense of their marriage was only just beginning. Who was this woman? How did a homeless bride know the structural weaknesses of an adobe house? And why did she look at the storm not with fear, but with the expression of someone who had seen much worse, and won? The wind howled louder, and as the first flash of lightning illuminated the room, Luke saw Anna grabbing a heavy wooden beam to brace the door. She moved with a rhythmic, calculated power that defied her aching confession. "Luke," she called out over the roar of the thunder. "The storm isn't the only thing coming for us. Silas Vane's men were at the gate when I came in. They aren't waiting for the morning to see if you can pay your debts." The suspense tightened like a noose. The instant karma was circling, but it wasn't just for the town bullies, it was a test for Luke himself. Would he protect the woman the world had discarded, or would he let the storm take them both? The storm wasn't just a weather event, it was a physical assault. Inside the crumbling adobe house, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of fear. Luke Tanner scrambled to position a rusted iron bucket under the largest leak, but the water was winning. Above them, the timber beams groaned like a ship breaking apart at sea. But as Luke turned to check on Anna, he didn't see a woman cowering in the corner. He saw a woman whose aching body had been forged in the fires of a much harder life. "The wind is coming from the north-northwest," Anna shouted, her voice cutting through the thunder with a sudden, clinical precision. She wasn't just guessing, she was observing. "If we don't brace the western wall with the dining table, the pressure will blow out the windows. Once the air pressure changes inside, the roof won't just leak, it will lift off entirely." Luke stared at her, momentarily paralyzed by her shift in tone. This wasn't the homeless bride the town had laughed at. This was a strategist. "How do you know that?" he yelled back. "I told you, Luke. My father didn't just make me lift crates. He made me build the warehouses that held them. He saved a nickel on every nail by making his daughter study the mechanics of collapse." She grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table, a piece of furniture Luke usually struggled to move alone, and with a grunt of pained effort, she began to slide it toward the window. Luke dove in to help her, their shoulders brushing. For the first time, he felt the heat radiating from her, the heat of a survivor. But just as they jammed the table against the shuddering western wall, a sound more terrifying than the thunder echoed through the house. Thud. 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 A heavy, rhythmic pounding at the front door. Not the frantic knocking of a neighbor seeking shelter, but the calculated, heavy strike of a man who intended to break the door down. "Open up, Tanner," a voice roared, muffled by the rain but unmistakable in its malice. It was Red Garrick, Silas Vane's chief enforcer, a man known for collecting debts with a lead pipe and a cruel smile. "We know you're in there with that charity case wife of yours. Silas wants to settle the books before the ranch washes away." Luke's blood turned to ice. He looked at Anna. Her face had gone pale, her gray eyes wide, but her hands stayed steady on the table they were bracing. "They're here to take the land," she whispered. "They know the storm will do half their work for them. They want you to sign the transfer while you're desperate." "I'm not signing anything," Luke growled, reaching for the shotgun he kept above the mantel. "No." Anna grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "If you use that gun, the sheriff will have an excuse to hang you by morning. Silas owns the law in Bitter Creek. We have to beat them at their own game." The door groaned as a heavy shoulder slammed into it from the outside. The wooden latch was splintering. Luke looked at the hole in his roof, the water flooding his kitchen, and the wolves at his door. He felt like the loser he had been at the dusty spur, a man with no cards left to play. "Luke, listen to me," Anna said, her voice dropping to a low, intense hiss. She looked at the small wooden box sitting on the counter, the one thing she had saved. "You have to trust me. I know men like Red Garrick. They think I'm a low-status nobody. They think I'm invisible. Let them think that. Use their pride against them." The door finally gave way with a sickening crack. Red Garrick stepped into the room, flanked by two other men. They were soaked to the bone, their yellow slickers dripping mud onto the floor Anna had just spent hours scrubbing. Red held a sodden piece of parchment in his hand, the deed transfer. "Nasty night for a roof to cave in, Tanner," Red sneered, looking up at the pouring rain. He ignored Anna entirely, his eyes fixed on Luke with a predator's focus. "Silas is a generous man. He's willing to give you $50 for the deed tonight. It's enough for a stagecoach ticket out of here. If you wait until morning, when this house is a pile of mud, he'll give you nothing but a kick in the teeth." Luke felt the familiar itch in his palms, the gambler's urge to fold. But then he felt Anna's presence behind him. She wasn't hiding, she was standing perfectly still, watching Red with a gaze so cold it would have chilled the desert. "The ranch isn't for sale, Red," Luke said, his voice steadier than he felt. Red laughed, a harsh, wet sound. "Look around you, boy. You're drowning in your own kitchen. And you've got this mail-order charity to feed now. You can't even afford to fix a shingle." He turned his gaze toward Anna for the first time, his lip curling in disgust. "Hey, girl. You want to spend the rest of your life in a mud hut? Tell your husband to sign the paper so you can go back to whatever gutter Silas found you in." The silence that followed was heavy. Luke waited for Anna to shrink back, to cry, to play the victim the town expected her to be. Instead, she took a step forward, directly into the light of the flickering lamp. "Mr. Garrick," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "You're bleeding." Red blinked, confused. "What?" "Your left boot," she pointed. "You stepped in the runoff from the north paddock. That soil is high in alkaline lime because of the way Luke has been tilling it. If you don't wash that off in the next 5 minutes, it'll eat right through the leather and start on your skin. But then again, a man who works for Silas Vane probably doesn't know much about the land he's trying to steal." Red looked down, distracted for a split second by the genuine authority in her voice. In that second of hesitation, the low-status woman they had come to bully had shifted the power dynamic of the room. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Red snarled, stepping closer to her, his hand raised as if to strike. "You're just a beggar in a wet dress." "I may be a beggar," Anna said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying fire, "but I'm a beggar who knows that Silas Vane's own ranch is built on a fault line of shale. And I know that this storm, the one you're so happy about, is currently flooding his lower granaries because he was too cheap to build a proper foundation. While you're here trying to steal a few acres from Luke, your boss is losing half his winter's wheat." Red's eyes went wide. The information was too specific, too accurate to be a guess. "How could you know about the granaries?" "Because I watched the blueprints being drawn when I was 12 years old," Anna whispered. "Now, get out of our house. Before the mud consumes you, too." The suspense was electric. Red looked between the lonely cowboy and the homeless bride, realizing for the first time that he wasn't dealing with two victims. He was dealing with a team. He backed toward the door, the deed still in his hand, but his smugness was replaced by a flickering doubt. "This isn't over, Tanner." Red shouted over the wind. "Silas will have the sheriff here by dawn. You're living on borrowed time." As the men retreated into the night, slamming the broken door behind them, Luke turned to Anna. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him breathless. He looked at the woman who had just stared down the town's most dangerous man using nothing but her intellect. "Anna," Luke breathed. "Who are you? Truly?" She looked up at the hole in the roof, the rain matting her hair to her forehead. The aching was back in her eyes, but so was a sense of triumph. I'm the woman you married, Luke. And tonight, we're going to fix this roof. Because tomorrow we start taking this town back. The episode ends with Luke and Anna standing side by side in the rain-soaked kitchen, not as strangers bound by a bet, but as partners in a war they were only just beginning to understand. The morning light that broke over Bitter Creek was cold and unforgiving, illuminating the devastation the storm had left in its wake. Most of the town expected to find Luke Tanner's adobe shack dissolved into a pile of mud and homeless Anna weeping on the roadside. But as the sun climbed higher, a strange rumor began to ripple through the dusty streets. It started with the blacksmith, a burly, cynical man named Elias Thorne, who had been one of the loudest voices laughing at Luke's mail-order prize during the wedding. Elias had ridden past the Tanner ranch at dawn, intending to mock their misfortune, but he had stopped his horse dead in its tracks. What he saw wasn't a ruin. It was a marvel of desperate engineering. The hole in the roof had been patched not with haphazard boards, but with a sophisticated interlocking weave of river reeds and baked clay, a technique that shouldn't have been known by anyone in the territory. The drainage trenches around the house were cut with mathematical precision, diverting the remaining floodwater into a newly formed irrigation pond. But most shocking of all was Anna herself. She was standing on a ladder, her hands covered in gray silt, her face pale with the aching she had confessed, yet her eyes were focused with the intensity of a master builder. You there, girl? Elias called out, his voice gruff. Who told you to dig those trenches? You're going to drown the north pasture. Anna didn't even look down. The north pasture is already drowned, Mr. Thorne. If you had eyes to see, you'd notice your own forge is currently sitting in 2 feet of standing water because you built it in a topographical sink. I'm not drowning the pasture, I'm saving the foundation of this house by utilizing the natural grade of the land. If you want to save your bellows from rotting, I suggest you stop staring and start digging a 3-degree incline to the east. Elias was stunned. No low-status woman, let alone a mail-order bride from the gutter, should know the word topographical, let alone how to calculate an incline by sight. He spat on the ground and rode off, muttering about uppity women, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The suspense in town began to grow, not about when Anna would fail, but about who she actually was. By noon, the instant karma of the storm began to manifest in a way the town couldn't ignore. The elite of Bitter Creek, the men like Silas Vane who had spent their lives looking down on the poor, found their grand Victorian-style homes failing. The fancy imported wood was warping, the foundations were shifting in the mud, and the local builders were baffled. The town's primary well, the lifeblood of the community, had been contaminated by runoff. The water was gray, silty, and undrinkable. While the wealthy panicked, Luke and Anna worked in a rhythmic, silent synchronization. Luke found himself watching her with a mixture of awe and protective fury. He saw the way she winced when she reached too high, the way her breath hitched from the chronic pain in her joints, the aching down there that she had carried since childhood. Every time she moved, it was a testament to her resilience. She was a woman who had been broken by labor, yet she was using the very skills she had been forced to learn to save a man who had won her in a bet. Anna, sit down, Luke pleaded as she began to sharpen a set of old rusted tools. You've done enough. The roof is holding. The water is clear. You're going to collapse. I can't sit, Luke, she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of physical agony and emotional drive. If I sit, the pain catches up to me. As long as I'm moving, I'm ahead of it. Besides, they're coming. Who's coming? The people who mocked us, she said, looking toward the road. Hunger and thirst are great equalizers, Luke. They laughed when they thought we were below them. Now that the world is washing away, they'll remember that nobody knows how to survive. Sure enough, a carriage appeared on the horizon, but it wasn't the sheriff. It was the blacksmith, Elias Thorne, looking humbled and frantic. Beside him sat the town's doctor, a man who had once refused to look Anna in the eye. Tanner. Elias shouted as he climbed down, his boots squelching in the mud. The main town well is fouled. The children are getting sick from the silt. I tried to fix the pump, but the mechanism is jammed with grit and I can't get the pressure to hold. I remembered what the girls said this morning. About the incline and the drainage. Luke felt a surge of righteous indignation. You called her a charity case 3 days ago, Elias. You laughed while Silas Vane mocked her boots. Now you want her to fix your water. Elias looked at the ground, his face reddening. I'm a fool, Luke. I admit it. But the town is parched. If she really knows what she's doing, if she can fix the pump. I'll pay. I'll pay whatever she wants. The suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy. Luke looked at Anna, expecting her to turn them away, to savor the instant karma of their desperation. But Anna stepped forward, wiping her mud-stained hands on her apron. She looked at Elias not with hatred, but with a cold, professional pity. I don't want your money, Mr. Thorne, Anna said, her voice steady and echoing with an authority that seemed to come from another life entirely. I want your respect. Not just for me, but for every person you've looked down on because their clothes were torn or their pockets were empty. I will fix your well. But from this day forward, if I hear a single word of mockery toward my husband or this ranch, I will personally ensure that your forge never sees another fire. The drive to the town center was a gauntlet of shifting perspectives. People who had sneered at homeless Anna now watched from their porches with wide-eyed desperation as she approached the communal well. The lonely cowboy, Luke, walked beside her, his hand on his holster, a silent warning to anyone who thought to utter a slur. At the well, the mechanism was a disaster. The heavy iron pump had been forced, snapping the internal seal. The town's best mechanics had given up. Anna knelt in the mud, her aching limbs protesting every movement. She didn't just look at the pump, she listened to it. She tapped the iron, feeling for the vibrations, her mind tracing the blueprints she had memorized in her father's warehouse years ago. The seal isn't snapped, she announced to the gathered crowd. It's vapor-locked. You're trying to use brute force where you need a vacuum. She called for a piece of leather from the blacksmith's shop and a bucket of tallow. For 2 hours, under the scorching sun that followed the rain, she worked with the precision of a surgeon. The crowd grew silent, the suspense building as she reassembled the complex gears. Silas Vane watched from the balcony of the saloon, his face a mask of simmering rage. He saw his power slipping. He saw the low-status woman becoming a hero. With a final, sharp tug of the lever, a sound echoed from the depths of the earth, a deep, rhythmic thump hiss. Then, a gush of crystal-clear water erupted from the spout, splashing into the dry buckets of the onlookers. A cheer began to rise, but Anna didn't stay to hear it. She leaned heavily against the stone well, her face drained of color, her body finally demanding the rest she had denied it. Luke was there in an instant, catching her before she hit the mud. You did it, Anna, he whispered, his heart breaking for the pain she was clearly in. The water is clean, she gasped, her eyes fluttering. But the town is still dirty, Luke. Silas Vane won't let this stand. He doesn't want a hero. He wants a slave. Just then, a heavy shadow fell over them. It was the sheriff, but he wasn't there to thank her. He held a silver-plated warrant in his hand. Anna Tanner, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You're under arrest. Silas Vane has filed charges for the theft of trade secrets and illegal engineering. He says no mail-order girl knows these things unless she stole the plans from his office. The crowd went silent. The instant karma had turned into a nightmare. The suspense reached a fever pitch as Luke stepped between his wife and the law. She didn't steal anything. Luke roared. Then she can explain where she got the knowledge in a cell, the sheriff replied. But as they reached for her, Anna straightened her back one last time. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, heavy brass key, the same key that would eventually unlock the mystery of her identity. "I didn't steal the plans, Sheriff," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling calm. "I wrote them. And if you take me to that cell, you'll find out exactly whose name is on the deed to this entire town." The iron bars of the Bitter Creek jail felt like a cold sentence on a life that had only just begun to find its warmth. Anna Tanner sat on the edge of the hard wooden cot, her shoulders hunched, her breathing shallow. The dampness of the cell, exacerbated by the recent storm, made her aching limbs scream with a renewed, stabbing intensity. Every bone in her body seemed to vibrate with the memory of the crates she had hauled and the docks she had scrubbed. But as she sat there, she didn't look like a broken woman. She looked like a queen waiting for her court to realize they had made a fatal mistake. Outside the bars, the sheriff stood with his back to her, nervously polishing his badge. He was a man caught between his conscience and his benefactor. "You shouldn't have shown off like that, girl," he muttered, his voice thick with unease. "Silas Vane doesn't like it when people know more than he does. Especially not a mail-order bride who walked into town with mud on her shoes. He's calling it industrial espionage. Says you must have worked for his competitors back east." Anna looked up, her gray eyes piercing through the dim light of the lantern. "Is that what he calls it, Sheriff? Or is he just afraid that I can read the rot in the wood of his empire?" Before the sheriff could answer, the heavy front door of the jailhouse swung open. Silas Vane stepped inside, his polished boots clicking rhythmically on the floorboards, a sharp contrast to the squelch of the mud outside. He carried a silver-headed cane and a look of smug satisfaction. He gestured for the sheriff to leave, and with a hesitant glance back at Anna, the lawman retreated into the night. "So," Silas began, leaning against the bars of the cell. "The architect of the desert finds herself in a cage. Quite a fall for the woman who saved the town's water today, wouldn't you say?" "I'm still the same woman I was yesterday, Mr. Vane," Anna said softly. "The only thing that has changed is the location of your fear." Silas's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Fear? Don't be absurd. I own the bank, the land, and the very air you're breathing in this cell. I brought you here to offer you a deal. I've seen what you can do. You're wasted on that gambler, Luke Tanner. Sign a confession admitting you stole the engineering plans for the well pump, and I'll have the charges dropped. In exchange, you'll come to work for me. You'll be my head of infrastructure. You'll live in a house with silk sheets, and you'll never have to ache again." The suspense in the room was suffocating. This was the moment of instant karma where many would have folded. To a woman who had been homeless and mistreated, Silas's offer was a dream. But Anna only saw the nightmare beneath the silk. "You want me to lie so you can own my mind the way my father owned my body," she whispered. "You don't want an engineer, Silas. You want a ghostwriter for your greatness. You want to pretend you built this town when you've only ever bled it dry." Silas's face turned a dark, ugly purple. He reached through the bars, his hand tightening into a fist. "You're a nobody. A mail-order mistake. You'll rot in this cell until the adobe turns back to dust." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the lantern flickered and died. Left in the darkness, Anna felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Her back throbbed, a dull roar of pain that reminded her of every injustice she had ever endured. But she wasn't alone. A soft whistle sounded from the small, high window of the cell. "Anna." It was Luke. She scrambled to the window, her fingers catching on the rough stone. "Luke. You shouldn't be here. If the sheriff catches you." "The sheriff is currently distracted by a sudden fire in Silas Vane's hay barn," Luke said, his voice urgent and full of a new, fierce pride. "I've been home, Anna. I looked in the box. The one you saved from the storm." Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. "Did you find it?" "I found the ledger," Luke whispered. "And the brass key. But Anna, I also found the letters." The ones from the territorial governor. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me who your father really was? The reveal was a slow burn realization. The suspense shifted from Anna's safety to the true power she had been hiding. Because I needed to know if I could be loved for my brokenness before I was loved for my bank account, she said, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. My father was Jacob Blake, Luke. He didn't just own warehouses. He was the primary financier for the entire New Mexico expansion. Silas Vane didn't buy his debt. He stole it from my father's estate while I was traveling here. Every acre Silas claims to own is legally mine. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of the fire bell. The lonely cowboy was no longer just a man who had lost a bet, he was the husband of the woman who held the deed to the entire territory. What do we do? Luke asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the secret. Go to the stagecoach station, Anna commanded, her voice regaining its iron strength. There is a man arriving on the midnight coach. A lawyer named Marcus Reed. He has the original seals of the Blake estate. Tell him the invisible daughter is ready to collect her inheritance. And Luke, tell him to bring the sheriff's replacement. As Luke vanished into the shadows, Anna sat back down on her cot. The aching was still there, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like the weight of a pack mule, it felt like the armor of a warrior who had finally reached the end of a long, brutal war. She closed her eyes and waited for the morning, knowing that when the sun rose, the instant karma would hit Bitter Creek like a tidal wave. The elite of the town, the men who had mocked her for her tattered dress and her slow gait, were about to find out that the woman they had imprisoned didn't just have a key to a box, she had the key to their very lives. The dawn over Bitter Creek was not greeted with the usual birdsong, but with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. Word had leaked out that a fancy city man had arrived on the midnight stage, and he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 2 territorial marshals with silver stars that outshone the local law. In the center of town, Silas Vane stood on the steps of the bank, his face a mask of ironclad arrogance, flanked by Red Garrick and a dozen hired toughs. He expected a surrender. He expected Luke Tanner to come crawling, begging for his wife's release. Instead, he saw a ghost. The jailhouse doors didn't just open, they were thrown wide. Anna Tanner stepped out into the morning light, her aching limbs moving with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded silence. She was no longer wearing the mud-stained rags of a homeless bride. She wore a dress of charcoal silk, the one item she had kept hidden at the very bottom of her wooden box. Beside her walked Marcus Reed, a man whose briefcase held enough legal fire to burn the town to the ground. What is the meaning of this? Silas roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp edge of panic. Sheriff! Why is that prisoner walking free? I filed charges of espionage. The sheriff, however, was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood the 2 marshals, their hands resting comfortably on the grips of their peacemakers. Mr. Vane, Marcus Reed stepped forward, his voice a cool, professional blade. My name is Marcus Reed, executor of the Jacob Blake estate. I'm here to discuss a matter of significant clerical oversight regarding the land titles of this county. The townspeople gathered in a wide circle, their whispers dying down. Luke stood behind Anna, his hand on her shoulder, not to support her, but to stand as her shield. The lonely cowboy was no longer lonely, he was the consort of the most powerful woman in the territory. Blake estate. Silas laughed, though the sound was hollow. Jacob Blake is dead. He died in a gutter back east. His homeless daughter here is just a scavenger trying to claim what she never earned. Anna took a step forward. The sun caught the gray in her eyes, turning them into chips of flint. My father didn't die in a gutter, Silas. He died in his study, surrounded by the ledgers of men like you, men who borrowed his capital to build their empires, and then conveniently forgot to pay it back when the borders shifted. She turned to the crowd, her voice projecting with an authority that made the blacksmith and the doctor bow their heads in shame. For weeks, you've called me a beggar. You've laughed at my husband because he'd lost a bet to marry me. You looked at my hands and saw only the dirt, never realizing that the dirt came from building the very foundations you stand upon. She reached into Marcus Reed's briefcase and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume. It was the Black Ledger, the private record of Jacob Blake's secret investments. On page 42, Anna said, her voice echoing through the square, it shows that the land this bank sits on was never purchased by Silas Vane. It was leased from my father for a period of 10 years. That lease expired 6 months ago. As of this moment, Silas, you are a squatter in my house. The suspense was agonizing. Silas turned to Red Garrick, signaling him to do something, anything, to stop the words. Red stepped forward, but the click of Luke's revolver was faster. Don't even twitch, Red, Luke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The lonely cowboy has a lot of pent-up frustration from the way you talked to my wife in our kitchen. I'd love an excuse to settle the debt. Red froze. The instant karma was hitting like a physical weight. The men who had bullied the town were suddenly paralyzed by the law and the truth. It's a lie. Silas screamed, his face turning a frantic shade of white. Those papers are forgeries. This girl is a fraud. Then perhaps you can explain this, Marcus Reed said, pulling a final document from the case. It was a royal land grant, signed by the territorial governor. It names Anna Blake Tanner as the sole proprietor of the Bitter Creek Basin. It also includes an audit of the local bank's funds. It seems, Mr. Vane, that you've been using the townspeople's savings to pay off your own gambling debts in Santa Fe. The same debts you tried to frame Luke for. The crowd erupted. The people who had been oppressed by Silas's high interest rates and land grabs realized that their hero was a thief and their beggar was their savior. The social justice of the moment was overwhelming. Men and women who had previously turned their backs on Anna now surged forward, not with anger toward her, but with a desperate need for her to set things right. Anna held up a hand, silencing the crowd. She looked at Silas Vane, who was now trembling, his silver-headed cane clattering to the boardwalk. You told me in the cell that I was a nobody, Anna said, her voice dropping to a whisper that everyone could somehow hear. You told me I would rot until the adobe turned to dust. But look at you now, Silas. You're standing on my land, breathing my air, and begging for a mercy you never showed to a single person in this town. She didn't call for him to be hanged. She didn't call for a riot. The true, instant karma was much colder. Marshals, Anna said, turning her back on the man who had tried to destroy her. Take Mr. Vane to the cell he prepared for me. He wanted me to experience the foundations of this town. I think it's only fair he sees how they hold up from the inside. As Silas was led away in irons, his head bowed, the town stood in a stunned, respectful silence. Anna turned to Luke, the aching in her body momentarily forgotten in the warmth of his gaze. You kept the secret well, Luke whispered, his eyes shining with pride. I didn't keep it because of the money, Luke, she replied. I kept it because I wanted to see who would stand by me when the roof was leaking. You're the only man who didn't look at my price tag before you looked at my soul. But the story wasn't over. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus Reed pulled Luke aside. There's one more thing, Mr. Tanner. Something Anna doesn't even know yet. Her father's will had a final clause. A clause about the loneliest cowboy in the territory. The suspense reached its final peak. The reveal of Anna's status was just the beginning. The instant karma was about to reward Luke Tanner in a way that would change the frontier forever. The dust had settled over Bitter Creek, but the air at the Tanner Ranch was different now. It no longer smelled of desperation and dry rot, it smelled of cedar, fresh rain, and hope. The loneliest cowboy and the invisible daughter stood on the porch of a home that was no longer a shack, but a beacon. Over the last few months, Anna had used her inheritance not to build a mansion for herself, but to transform the ranch into a sanctuary for the low-status workers the town had previously discarded. The aching she had once confessed was fading, replaced by the strength of a woman who had finally found her purpose. But one final mystery remained, a secret that hung between Luke and Anna like a veil. Marcus Reed, the executor of the Blake estate, walked up the porch steps carrying a final, sealed envelope. His face was uncharacteristically solemn. "There is one last provision in Jacob Blake's will," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet evening. "A provision that was only to be opened once the thieves were in cages and the builders were in power." Luke felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He looked at his hands, hands that had once only known how to shuffle cards and pull triggers. He still felt like the man who had won a wife in a drunken bet. He felt like a fraud standing next to a woman of Anna's stature. "I don't need any more gold, Marcus," Luke said, his voice gruff. "I have everything I want right here." He looked at Anna, and the love in his eyes was the only wealth he cared for. "This isn't about gold, Mr. Tanner," Marcus replied, handing the envelope to Anna. "It's about a debt. A debt of a different kind." Anna opened the letter with trembling fingers. As she read, her eyes grew wide, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. She looked at Luke, then back at the paper, tears blurring her vision. "Luke," she whispered. "The bet at the Dusty Spur, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't luck." The suspense reached its breaking point. Luke stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Anna?" "I was drunk. I was reckless. I lost the hand." "No," Anna said, her voice shaking with emotion. "My father, he knew you, Luke. Years ago, before you came to Bitter Creek, you were in a camp near the border. There was an old man, a surveyor, who had been bitten by a rattler and left for dead by his guides. A young cowboy stayed with him for 3 days, giving him his own water, carrying him 5 miles on his back to the nearest outpost. That cowboy never gave his name. He just left the man with a doctor and vanished." Luke's mind raced back. I remember an old man. But that was just what anyone would do. That man was my father, Jacob Blake," Anna revealed, the instant karma of a decade-long cycle finally coming full circle. "He spent years looking for you. He knew Silas Vane was a snake, and he knew Silas would eventually try to ruin you. My father didn't lose me to you in a bet. He arranged the entire game. He hired the dealer. He made sure that the punishment for your loss was the one thing he knew you would protect with your life, the daughter of the man you once saved." The revelation hit Luke like a thunderbolt. The lonely cowboy hadn't been tricked into a marriage, he had been rewarded for a moment of selflessness he had long forgotten. The universe hadn't been punishing him for being a gambler, it had been waiting for the right moment to return the kindness he had shown to a stranger. He knew, Luke breathed, the weight of his own perceived failures finally lifting. "He knew I'd take care of you. He knew you were the only man who wouldn't see me as a tool," Anna said, stepping into his arms. "He knew that two people who had been underestimated by the world would be unstoppable if they stood together." The final, instant karma, was a total transformation of the community. With Silas Vane behind bars, the town of Bitter Creek underwent a moral revolution. The low-status individuals, the homeless, the injured, and the overlooked, were hired to rebuild the infrastructure under Anna's expert guidance. They weren't just workers, they were stakeholders. The blacksmith, Elias Thorne, became the head of the new industrial school, and the aching workers of the old warehouses were given healthcare and fair wages from the Blake Trust. The story ends as the sun sets over the horizon, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and violet. Luke and Anna stand at the gate of the Blake Tanner Sanctuary. A group of new arrivals, families who had lost everything in the East, approach the gate, looking weary and afraid. Luke steps forward, no longer the cynical gambler, but the protector of the hearth. He looks at their tattered clothes and their tired eyes, and he doesn't see beggars. He sees the same resilience he saw in Anna. "Welcome home," Luke says, his voice warm and steady. "Leave your burdens at the gate. Here, we don't care where you came from. We only care about where we're building together. Anna stands beside him, her hand in his. The aching is gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. She looks at the camera, or the reader, with a gaze that says everything. Respect isn't something you earn from the powerful, it's a seed you plant in the hearts of the humble. And when the storms of life come, those who were once nothing will be the ones who hold up the world.